And we're live. Mr. Slumbers, you've disappeared. Oh, you've come back again onto the screen.
Am I doing something? Am I messing something up here?
No, you're back. Anyway.
Technology, don't you hate it?
Oh man, it's lovely, isn't it? Isn't it lovely? What a start. So welcome back. We thought you and I would start our little chats again, didn't we? So
Absolutely. Both had a busy summer, so it's time to start again. You've been running around the world, and I've been running around half the world.
Yeah, it's true. Have you got a busy couple of weeks coming up, or are you relatively?
No, I'm in the final stages before my the second cohort of my generative AI for real estate people course starts on 23rd of November. So I'm really just working away on that. So reading, thinking, that sort of stuff. And it's funny. I was saying to someone the other day that I started such a long time ago, back in 1995, and that was unbelievably exciting. Then that was even before there was a release version of Netscape browser out, and things were changing every single day, and every single week, new stuff would be happening. And to be honest, there has never been a time like that until this year with all the generative AI stuff. It's every day, every week, there's some new thing and something material as well. And it's like a super exciting time.
Oh, it's good, isn't it? It's nice. It's nice to do that. And I think for for nearly 30 years, I mean, that says a lot, doesn't it? That you're there. But 23rd of November is my son's 13th birthday.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, well, that's
two teenagers in the house.
Wow. Heavy,
not so good.
Say.
Yeah, tell me about it. Well, let's just explain it to people who may have watched it before and listened in. But this is our sort of regular catch-up and relatively informal. Anthony and I just like to read a lot and try and digest a lot. And in a way, this was sort of the thing that we were doing anyway, which was we were talking to each other about our feelings on particular articles or in particular books. And we thought, well, look, why don't we share it with the world and have a chat about it all? And that's really what we do on this show, and just discuss a load of things through. And we kind of pick out one or two articles that we've been reading each week and do a sort of a deep dive into it and get each other's opinions on what they think of it at all. And that's really what this show's about. So I've got just as a summary, I've got a couple of articles because I'm in a deep dive research piece at the moment around sort of the digital transformation side, and I'm really diving into innovation leadership and the different facets of innovation. So I've been reading quite a lot this week around the differences between incremental, radical innovation, and there's a new sort of facet of innovation which I'm going to talk about. And in particular, an article I'm going to talk about is looking at the funding problems that traditional and incumbent industries have into spending on innovation, which is why quite often they get left behind. And funnily enough, Anthony, you mentioned Netscape. Netscape is a classical example of a company that was at the cutting edge, but because they were only really looking at incremental improvements, they actually got left behind by new players coming into the market. So that's my sort of look at for this week. So really, like I said, innovation. And I'm actually going to talk about a book this week as well. I'm going to start with that. But Anthony, what have you got to talk about this week? What's your major focus?
Well, maybe not surprisingly, and because we've been away for a while, I wanted to concentrate on two of what I think are the most important reads in the world of generative AI for this year. A very big report that McKinsey put out in June about the economic potential of generative AI. And then a write-up of a large research project that was done as jointly between the BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, Harvard, Wharton, and MIT, where they got 758 BCG consultants doing a controlled study for using generative AI in two particular categories. And they had with GPT, they did it with OpenAI's GPT-4, with GPT-4 without, with GPT-4 plus training, and then the control group without anything. And they are the two. If you're only going to read two things about this topic, they are absolutely absolutely the best things to read to give you an understanding of why this is important and what this stuff does and what it doesn't do.
Cool. Okay, well, that sounds good. Well, I'm just going to start by showing, for those of you who are watching this, I've been reading the Office Shock book this week. Anthony, I know you've read this, I think. I know you've read this, I think. That doesn't quite work, does it? But a few people in our sector have read this. So Office Shock, Creating Better Futures for Working and Living by Johansson Press and Bullen, who are all from the Institute of the Future. I have to say, I didn't enjoy this book at all. I don't know if you had a view on it at all, Anthony, but
I'm actually quite glad you said that, James, because I have to say I didn't either.
Okay, well that makes two of us. I heard somebody else, I think it was Simon Davis, talked about it being very generic and over sort of like more of an overview. But I have to say, I found myself flicking through elements of this at the end. It was very, very. It talks about office shock and the whole point and principle. This was written just after COVID-19 and talking about the principles of the return to office. And there were some elements in this which I think were great in theory, like the principle of future back, as in the way that the Institute of the Future look is they look 50 years in the future, but always 10 years behind. And I thought that was quite interesting as a perspective of actually where our industry, I think, doesn't look. I think they look 2 years in the future, and very rarely do they look at sort of past performance. So I thought that was quite an interesting principle. But if I'm brutally honest, the rest of it I found thoroughly it was more like a consultant writing for something generic rather than actually about the future of the office. So
the looking future back thing is a good idea. It's a bit like the Steve Jobs things of start with the customer experience and then work back to the technology.
Yeah.
And I always bastardize that with start with the customer experience and work back to the real estate. But particularly in real estate, because a major real estate project is a decade, it's 7 to 10 years. And so we really do need to be thinking further forward than many other industries need to. Because I would be very comfortable to say what the office would be like in a year, probably 2 years, 5 years. I'm starting to get a little bit shaky. 10 years, I don't think I'd put a penny on it. So you have then it comes down to planning for uncertainty. But where that book really sort of irritated me actually was the curse of business books, where, as somebody said, it should have been a 1-hour podcast or a lengthy article in the Harvard Business Review, because every chapter they started by saying, well, what they're going to tell us, then they told it to us, and then they reviewed exactly what they have just told us, and then they did what we're going to tell you in the next chapter. Yeah. So you really could chop that down 90%. But hey, you've always got to. Sometimes you need to skim in and out of these things, and going on to my hobby horse. One of the reasons I like generative AI so well is that I have so many reports come across my desk, as it were, my virtual desk, that I just cannot read everything. But generative AI is really, really good at summary.
Yeah.
So particularly, not actually, ChatGPT isn't so good, but Claude is fabulous for doing summaries, because it has a thing called it has a much bigger what they call a context window, which means the amount of material that it can analyze at one time. So an awful lot of I've almost got into workflow that something will pop into my Twitter feed or my email or on LinkedIn. I would just download it, upload it to Claude. There's various different ways to get quite good summaries out of things. Get a summary, and if it seems interesting, I'll read it. But there's a lot of things just on this idea of, and it's something that I'm sure you're covering a lot with digital transformation. One of the things you have to do in this world is look wide. You need to look across the sphere and across industries and whatever. So, but there's lots of things you don't need to know in depth from another industry. But you might take a report, or I don't know. I had one came in the other day of about the luxury fashion industry, and just put it in that, and in 30 seconds and a minute of reading, it's like, oh, that's what That's what's going on in that industry.
Yeah, but so to bring it back neatly to this book, I think you're absolutely right. This book could have easily just been stuck right into getting a summary of it, and it would have been quite interesting. I mean, I think the principle they came up with, you got to think about the office verse, which is the future, anytime, any place in the world, and it could be shared spaces, networked offices, home offices, office buildings, and they've each got their own. You and I talk about jobs to be done a lot. They've each got their purpose. So that I thought was relatively okay. They talk about what's called the mixing board, and the questions that you should be asking yourself is, what is the purpose of the office or officing? They talk about office being both a verb and a noun.
You just reminded me, my absolute pet hate was that word, officing. That's just the worst word ever.
Well, okay. So I tell you what. So while we're here, let me just read that out, because obviously, anything I can do to annoy you anymore. And by the way, what I'm just going to show. Hey, Luke. Nice to see you, mate. It's been a while. Good to see you, Lukey. Thank you. So office is a place, but it's also a process. Office is a noun. Office places are mostly in buildings, but that's changing. Officing is a verb that describes work processes and social interaction to get work done. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right to be annoyed by that, to be honest. But back onto the basic principles, which I think, and I'm going to conclude on here because it's about the only useful thing I got out of this book. To prepare for the opportunities of office shock, every individual office worker, organization, and policymaker should ask in this order: what is the purpose of your office and officing? And again, I believe that is not just about what is historically viewed as an office, but also what you need to be looking at forward thinking about what the office is. What are your desired outcomes you aim to achieve with your office and that of your office activities? What will the climate impact of your office buildings and the way that you're working? Now, I found that quite a flippant throwaway section, but I actually think that's going to increase in importance as we go, because that is going to be a bottom up, I think, principle where, as society gets, as the current Gen Z coming into the office space, I think that's going to be more and more and more important to justify the climate impact of offices. With whom do you want to office? I think that's a really important point. How will you amplify the intelligence of your office? And there's a big mixture there about social mixing and coming together and celebrating what I call the inefficiencies of the office, which is about amplifying intelligence. Where and when will you office? I think, which is an absolutely critical point in this current area as well, because of the different sort of generations that we have. And I don't know, did you see that fantastic, there was, I think it was a TikTok of a young lady who was just joining her first ever job, and it was a 9 to 5, and she got completely ridiculed by the older generation for, saying how hard a 9 to 5 job was. Did you see that, Anthony?
I did see it, and I thought it's actually,
come on, what did you think?
Pretty disgusting and pretty telling, and not surprised the type and the particular type of people that really laid into her. And Jason Calacanis laid into her. It's a really big time tech bro VC podcaster was being incredibly snotty and patronizing to her. And then of course Jason works at home. But the whole point was there's all these sorts of older people. I hate the tendency of older people to go, well, my life sucked, therefore your life's got to suck as well. And
no, it's not that though, is it? Come on, it's not my life sucks, therefore yours has to.
No, but I commuted for 20 years, so exactly. why shouldn't you? And it's saying, and it's looking at the way we work as if it's an absolute. It has to be this way, and that's really what she was pointing out. That for a new person coming in, you suddenly realise, why am I spending 3 hours a day on a train? This just does not make any sense at all. This is just silly. And so arguing for the perpetuation of old and bad ways of doing things is not a good idea. And I poor girl, she's only young. She had 200,000 rich blokes shouting at her.
And sadly, mainly rich blokes. You're right. But I think to draw that to a conclusion, I think that is a core principle of looking forward, which is when and where are you going to office? And the point is, what she was quite rightly talking about was the centralization of office community, the centralization of office activity, and it doesn't need to be done that way. And I think that actually got lost with all the diatribe that was coming out. And anyway,
it's very cultural. It's a very cultural thing, this as well, James. At a personal level, I've always thought one has to decide how one wants to live. You know, part of the way you design your career and the work you want to do and where you're going to work should be based on, these are the things I value, and I would like to craft my life in accordance with the way I want to live. And that's why so many people start their own businesses, because
but that's where I think you're wrong with that, Anthony, because I think you're looking at it from being an entrepreneurial mindset.
But that's what I meant, though.
Exactly. But the lion's share of people are not entrepreneurial, and therefore they get on the treadmill of life, and that's where it all goes wrong.
Well, that is true. But increasingly, if you start to look at the stats and the trends around employment and labour and the number of contingent workers in all different scales of glory that large companies pay for now. You know, it used to be the case that large companies would employ hundreds of thousands of people. Now, mostly the large companies actually don't employ that many people, and they make a great deal of use of contingent people in one way or another. Yeah. And that does seem like, you know, the atomization of work seems like a very powerful trend that's going to develop, and partly around you know, the move to hybrid and remote. I mean, it's probably worth dwelling on this a little bit. I went to an event the other day, and there was a French chap on there, and he was saying, well, to be fair, he worked for one of the big real estate companies, but he made a point which I think was true. He said, look, if people are 100% remote, then I worry for their jobs in countries like ours. Because countries like ours are really, really expensive, and America's really, really expensive. If you are 100% remote, you are going to be outsourced unless you have a very particular skill. And not that many people have very particular skills.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
and that's, you know, that's unless you see quite a lot of these sort of digital nomad types on social media, all sending photographs from their latest office by a swimming pool with a beautiful backdrop. And you think, yes, but you know, this is a niche. This is a niche. You need a very particular skill set to be able to be a digital nomad and to work somewhere fully remote. And a lot of people need to be careful what they wish for on this front, and either develop your very special skill, which is the more sort of entrepreneurial bent, or to be more cognizant of wakey, you know, yes, you don't need to show willing in the sense of being there 5 days a week, but don't be too standoffish, because you're very expensive sitting there in New York or London or whatever.
But I mean, you know, to conclude, that's precisely why this book is a pile of poo in my mind, because it sounds flippant, and it shouldn't sound flippant, but it does, in the sense of what you've just summarized in 2 minutes is probably, I mean, that much of the book for me was frankly not worth its time. It was too much theory about generic non-office based stuff when the whole entire title was about office shock. And you know what that
there's bigger forces at work, James, isn't there? That's the.
Of course there are, but the point is, Anthony, that you know this is talking about office shock and how we are, you know, meant to be returning to office, but it bears very, very, very little time on anything to do with what they term as the office first, which is the principle of the home office, which is the principle of, what else did they talk about? The office buildings, the shared places, the networked offices as a grand plan. It just seemed like they were trying to put in too many buzzwords. I mean, you know, they love the metaverse, which I know you're a massive fan of. But it was because it was at the time when the metaverse was massively popular. So anyway, I'm going to say, don't bother. But I am going to say, I don't know have you ever read this one?
What's that one? It's upside down.
It probably doesn't say When Coffee and Kale Compete. You read that?
No, I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Good book. Good book. If any of you are trying to understand jobs theory, as in jobs to be done theory, and you're a product person, or you're an entrepreneur, or you are somebody who is in a traditional company looking at entrepreneurial pursuits, this one is well worth doing in terms of understanding the principles of jobs theory and how it makes you start thinking about understanding the social, functional, and emotional jobs that a person does in their day-to-day life. And it's got, plenty of different case studies of entrepreneurial activities which have resulted in really great products. So that is one which is definitely worth the read. But I'm very conscious.
Name again?
It's called When Coffee and Kale Compete by Alan Clement.
Right. Excellent.
Well worth a look. But right, come on, tell me about one of your two. You said these are the two most important and the only articles you need to read when it comes to AI. So let's do a deep dive into one of those, shall we? Pick your best one. Give us an overview.
Do you see my screen there?
Yeah, I've got it now. So if you go to the article, it's currently showing us.
Right. Okay.
So flick over to the.
Sorry,
flick over to the article itself.
I'm on a different. I think.
It's all right. What's the article called, Anthony?
And I'm just showing the right window.
There we go. Got it. Yeah. So it is, for those of you who are watching, it's now on the screen. You might want to zoom in a little bit for people who just zoom in a little bit more. Perfect. Right, talk to us. What's the name of this article?
It was in June. It's called The Economic Potential of Generative AI.
It's a McKinsey publication, right?
By McKinsey, and it's one of their big ones. But there's a few particular points in it that are really worth looking up. First is that using generative AI in just a few functions could drive most of the technology's impact. So the areas that Gen AI is likely to have the biggest impact is, which is sort of at the top right here. So software engineering, so software, customer operations, sales, marketing, and product research and development. Those are the really big area. And then the thing that's really interesting is, as a result of generative AI, experts assess that technology could achieve human-level performance in some technical capabilities sooner than previously thought. And they did a big report back in 2017 of the impact of AI on the economy and jobs. And this is an update of it. And essentially, without going through it in detail, what they found is it's basically brought everything forward about 10 years. So
when you say it's brought everything forward, what do you mean by that?
So, for instance, if you look at the second one down here, creativity,
yeah.
In 2017 with traditional AI,
yeah.
creativity was actually something that wasn't assumed to be something that AI would really have much to do with. And, for many years, people said, if you want to avoid being put out of a job by AI, we'll do something creative because machines can't be creative. Well, dirty little secret is it turns out they can be. So they were reckoning sort of the medium to top quartile developments of creativity were going to be 2030 all the way through to the mid 2060s before AI really had an impact on creativity. They now reckon it's basically from now to the early 2030s that it's going to start having a big impact. So it's having an impact across lots of different sectors much faster than we thought. And then you need to think in terms of, well, where's going to go faster? And actually sort of read my point just now, automation adoption is likely to be faster in developed economies where higher wages will make it economically feasible sooner. Because, so much to do with technological automation is a function of labor costs. You don't bother investing in robots when labor's incredibly cheap. Hence people move around the world to get cheap labor, and then sooner or later they all end up like China or South Korea, but before it they suddenly become expensive, and then they start investing in technology. But of course, everywhere in the West is already really expensive, so it doesn't take you that far to start thinking, well, if I've got 100,000 to spare, well, maybe I'll buy a robot instead of a person. So it's likely to move forward a lot quicker. Now, the really interesting thing is
hang on, just go back there, Anthony, because I think that's quite an interesting point, which perhaps hasn't really been laboured enough previously. Because prior to the latest sort of wave of generative AI that's come out, it was often thought that the real problem was going to be in very low-skilled manual work. And whereas in India, China could really suffer with their sort of poorer working class population. But actually, what we're now seeing here is that what you've talked about there in terms of that, expedited creativity and perhaps more of the slightly higher skilled areas, combining that with the fact that in the West we have much higher cost of our services and our skills. Actually, we're increasing the rate of our potential.
It's a very big structural change, James. Creativity was something that was thought to be outside of the remit of AI, and also advanced intelligence and expertise was expected to be outside of the remit. But it turns out that that's not the case. In fact, there's a wonderful quotation by well-known computer scientist called Pedros Domingos, and he said, generative AI is the revenge of the working classes. It's the middle classes that now have to start looking out for their jobs. And it's an interesting thing, frankly, none of us were that bothered when we were moving factories to the east. We're going to be a lot more bothered when we're moving our jobs. But if I take you to the next slide, this is an absolute killer slide. Generative AI could have the biggest impact on collaboration and the application of expertise, activities that previously had a lower potential for automation. So if you look here, so the light blue is with generative AI, the black is without generative AI. So applying expertise. So in 2017, when they did the previous report, they reckoned that would impact about 24.5% of expertise jobs. Look at it now, 58.5%. Managing, 15.5% in 2017, nearly 50% today. Interfacing with stakeholders goes from 24 to 40 to 45. And they're talking about it in terms of the automation of expertise is a really big thing. And we're going to come on to this in the second paper, where I'm going to talk about how actually generative AI is actually a very powerful leveler of between experts and lower ranked, in inverted commas, people. So you have advances in technical capabilities could have the most impact on activities performed by educators, professionals, and creatives. So again, look at this: business and legal professionals with generative AI, overall technical automation potential, 62%, without 32. Educator and workforce training. Workforce training is, I think, an absolute bullseye for generative AI, and there's going to be a ton of it. And its ability to train the workforce is huge compared to where it was before. But even the cases within STEM, the last 10 years, everyone has said, "Oh, you've got to go and learn you'll get your STEM degrees and become a coder." Well, frankly, going forward, do not be a coder unless you're a really, really good coder, because technology is going to be able to outcode average coders very, very soon. So you need to be really good. So the change from what are the high value skills that we thought would be high value to the ones that perhaps will be high value is really interesting. And it is sort of, in many ways, revenge of the humanities student. Actually understanding Shakespeare and the like is a pretty good thing to know in 2023, whereas in 2020 you would have thought, well, it's a complete waste of time because I needed to know code. No, you don't. You need to know human nature, and you need to know how to work with people, and etc. So I've just got two more. It's a very long report, but I'm just picking up these big ones.
It was a tremendously long report and very detailed, but
it's a blinder. Generative AI increases the potential for technical automation, most in occupying occupations requiring higher levels of educational attainment. It's even the case of it really is the case of just because you've got a master's or higher, or you think you're particularly skilled, you need to really pay attention to this stuff. And then the final point here, and this is incredibly important, generative AI could contribute to productivity growth if the labor hours saved can be redeployed effectively. And this is a massive question, James, which fits into your business transformation. Are we going to be using these technologies to augment people or replace people? And that is a really fundamental choice that society and business and regulators need to think about in terms of policies and regulation and laws and taxation and incentives and all that. If we incentivize people to use these technologies to get rid of people, that's going to have one consequence.
Yeah.
If we incentivize businesses and companies to use this technology to raise the bar and lift up everyone, that's going to have a very different application. So we're genuinely getting to the stage where these are big choices that need to be made at a society level, because this is not trivial. This is going to impact everything.
No, you're right. But if I may say though, Anthony, I think I'm just going to take you off screen share here for a second. I think the interesting element there is why you found, I think it was reported, it may have been 5 or 6 years ago, pre-COVID, that I remember reading it, that for the first time ever, tech companies are hiring philosophers.
Yes. Yeah.
Because these are big debates about societal challenges that we've not had to have for centuries. And as a consequence, we need these thinkers to come in to challenge conventional thinking. Yeah. Because, that point about society of whether we augment or replace is such a significant thing. I'm actually just going to bring in a comment, and this is a question. Mervy, thanks ever so much for your couple of questions. I did see a couple come in. So I'm just going to bring, I don't know if this will show, yeah, here it is. So when do you think hiring real people instead of using technology due to lack of resources will become relevant? Using resources to maintain people instead of using resources to maintain technology robots. And she goes on to say, I know this kind of thinking is not going to be popular anytime soon, is how it finished. Any thoughts on that from Mervy?
My feeling with all this stuff is, and this is pure anecdote based on how I found things. You really do get a lot more out of these systems if you play with them as a human, and you work with them as a human, and you put
100%.
The human plus machine, which is something I've thought about and advocated for a long time. I still think human plus machine is going to trump in stuff that matters, technology, machine on its own for a very long time. And I think we are going to need to become more skilled in how we leverage these systems. So one of the things I think is massively important going forward is each of ours ability to think critically. Critical and abstract and critical thinking is incredibly important, because we are genuinely moving to a world where we're going to have no idea what is real or not real. And so our ability to analyze the world around us with a critical, and note critical, not skeptical, critical viewpoint is going to become enormously important. And I think we're all going to find out that there's much talk in tech bro land of abundance, but a lot of these technologies could lead to a certain sort of abundance. But an abundance for 2% of the world's population is no fun. And even the idea of universal basic income, mostly people want to do stuff. And I think societal design is going to become incredibly important. I mean, it's interesting. Mervy's of
So-
course in Helsinki in Finland, and the Nordics have a very different approach to society than a lot of other places.
Well, and let's bring in that. You talked about universal basic income. I mean, they've already done the trials in Helsinki, and largely it was proved relatively positive. But I'm just going to sort of piggyback on one of the things you said there about the human plus machine, and you and I have been advocates of that for a long time. And I'm only going to take you back to one presentation that I gave once, and I was asked a question about what would you recommend to your children. And I just said, I would recommend the ability to communicate being absolutely critical. And I said, but not just human to human communication, but human to machine communication. If you understand the mechanics and the mechanisms of getting the best out of that machine, your children will be well on the way. And that is exactly where prompt engineering is now coming, or has come and potentially gone. But, it's a fascinating area.
Can I just pick up on another one of Mervy's points?
Yeah.
She says, my interest has shifted from the need for change in offices to the
I'll just bring that in here. There we go.
For the need for change in urban development, for obvious reasons, and since transformation of cities is much slower. This is such a key point, because if you just follow through the logic of the way we use offices has changed, we are 100% definitely on a per person basis going to need less formal HQ style central business district offices. So what are we going to do with these? What are we going to do with these buildings? And what type of buildings do we need for a world where, let's just say, the 15-minute city actually does happen, when we all live in areas where within 15 minutes of where we are, there's everything we need. And really, if you're remote and hybrid working, you should be able to do that. The form factor of the city, the form and the function of the city becomes a very different thing. And each city has got to pay a lot more attention to how do we want this city to develop to protect us? If you think of the city as a business, how do we make our city resilient for the needs and requirements of 10 years time, 15 years, 20 years time? It's a big question, which
but I also think, again, but I'm gonna counter that a little bit. I dislike intently the 15-minute city principle. I think it's misconsidered. I think it's very it's very biased towards Western economies and Western cities. I think it needs to be rethought of as what I've termed as citizen-centric cities, where not all cities are able to create ever a 15-minute city. It simply will not happen. But the core principle is that of being citizen-centric, and I think that's the critical element to it. But just picking up on Mervy's point here, and I'm just going to share my screen here a second. Did you see, in fact, it was actually Brendan Wallace who shared this today, actually. Can you see this okay, Anthony?
Yeah, if you could play.
So for those of you who are actually listening rather than watching, this is about the White House wanting to accelerate the office to residential conversion. So it's this new take on offices. So to give a bit of context, workers are in the office 30% less days than they were pre-pandemic. Office vacancy is a 30-year high of 18.2%, and vacant offices hurt local businesses. So last week, the White House released a guidebook on all available federal resources to make commercial to residential conversions more affordable, because the conversions are good for the climate, good for the economy, and they also address the housing shortage. Now, this has come up time and time again in recent panels and conferences I've attended. It was I did an economic panel discussion with two really serious chief economists from Eastern Europe, and this whole matter of office to residential conversions came up. And the question was, has it ever really worked? And their criticism of this was, yes, all of it is a good idea in principle, as has been outlined here from Brendan, and obviously the White House are behind it. And, everything about it sounds right. They said, but it's all well and good. However, very sadly, it can't work because the office valuations and the residential valuations are so far out of kilter. It's almost a physical impossibility without a 30 to 40% devaluation of the office stock, which isn't going to happen. So I found that
actually, James, hang on a moment though. In terms of it isn't going to happen. The first thing about residential to commercial is it probably applies to 20-25% of office buildings, and
why 20-25?
A lower percent in particularly in America, where you have these very large, very deep buildings that the only way you can convert them is if you punch a huge great hole in the middle. So it doesn't economically make sense. But I did have actually someone very senior in one of the investment managers reply to something I put on LinkedIn a while ago, where they said, "Oh well, wait until it's 35p in the pound, and see what happens then." And they genuinely think there's a lot of buildings which are going to lose a huge amount of value.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's no question of that.
Absolutely huge amount.
But what we're in now is we're in a slow death march to that happening.
Well, we're in that sort of liminal state where we've fallen off the cliff and we're going down, but we don't know quite where the bottom is yet. But you have to look at this. You have to look at this on the glass half full side as well. This is what happens in real estate. It's boom and bust, and everyone who's known as a genius in real estate is the person who bought low and sold high. And everyone who's an idiot is the person who bought high and sold low. But
I think what it will do is it really answers a question about what's going to be done if you're not a grade A office block. If grade A is going to always do well.
Well, exactly. The degree of obsolescence is enormous. Cushman and Wakefield did a report earlier in the year called Obsolescence and Opportunity, and they reckoned there's only 15% of US office stock which is fully fit for purpose through to 2030. 15%. In Europe, they did it, and they reckoned about 25% of office stock was fit for purpose. In the US, they reckoned 25% was already obsolete, and another 20-something% was on the way. And in Europe, it was about 15%. But in Europe, they said there's like 60-odd% of space, which is in that it's not really cheap enough and it's not really good enough.
Yeah.
And the degree of dislocation within the market is truly going to be something to behold, because there's which just goes a lot further forward into making the point about cities need to be thinking of this, society needs to be thinking this. The plus side, of course, is you start a completely new cycle, new money will come in, new form factors will develop, new business models, and hopefully in 20 years' time, our real estate will be a hell of a lot better than it is today.
Fingers crossed. That's a lovely way of putting it, isn't it? Let's see what happens. Well, look, I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to just flick on and just talk about something which I think is a really important principle at the moment. So something I've been reading just to sort of recap. For me, as I look to write about the digital transformation play that we've got going ahead at the moment in the real estate world, there are probably 9 potential areas where there needs to be focus, and the usual things are in there. So culture, people, organization, strategy, leadership, all of the things that you expect in digital transformation is in there. But one of them, for me, one of the areas or the chapters I'm deep diving in at the moment is around innovation and the concept of innovation and the different sorts of innovation. So just to sort of summarize, I think we are rather short-sighted within the built environment as a sector. And actually, I think more generally, at the very start of a digital transformation journey, I think every industry can be a little bit short-sighted as to what innovation is and what it isn't, what disruption is and what it isn't. And I think there's often a fear that they are one of the same. And very early on, I've often felt, and I don't know if you agree with this, Anthony, that the real estate industry thought that the technology disruption was coming and it wasn't about a gradual innovation. Do you feel that's fair? And that's why the real estate industry sort of put the blinkers on a little bit, because it was too much about disruption. And I think the lexicon and the narrative coming from the tech sector was very much, we're going to disrupt the industry and we're going to come and break it down so we can do it better. Do you think that's a fair?
I've always thought tech people going on about disruption is a very easy way to really piss off all your customers very quickly. You know, it's a very aggressive way of, well, you know, it's too redolent of, all you idiot Luddites, we're going to throw you out and replace you.
But it's something that I've certainly seen. I don't know if that's what you've seen, that we certainly, probably the mid 2010s, it was all about disruptive forces of tech. And that was never going to bring the traditional industry on side.
No, I agree, because not least of all, real estate is a very slow moving for very obvious reasons, and it's not software. And you know what they say, hardware is hard. You know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, so let me just share this here. So one of the articles I've been reading this week has really sort of it's a very academically based article about disruptive innovation enabling practitioners to tackle the innovator's dilemma. So the innovator's dilemma is such that I always use a good example for me is Rightmove. I think Rightmove had a classic case of the innovator's dilemma, which is they built such a good product that they were making so much money and are making so much money that there was no incentive to necessarily change. But they're absolutely screwed if somebody else comes over because they've got nowhere to go. And the innovator's dilemma is, I think, it's a fascinating. I think it's a Christian.
It's Clayton Christensen thing.
Yeah, it's his theory. But this was the article, and really, I just wanted to sort of incorporate an element of understanding about the different forms of innovation which are out there. So what we talk about a little bit, and I'm just going to zoom in on this graph here, is it talks about the different forms of innovation which you can see. Can you see this okay, Anthony?
Yeah, just about. One more time.
Hang on, I'm going to go up a little bit.
There we go. That's good.
There you go. Got that?
Yeah.
So what it's talking about, and this is a graph which is showing time along the x-axis and product performance on the y-axis, and it shows the different forms of innovation that there are. And for me, I often think that the real estate industry and other industries for that matter really focus on innovation being all radical and disruptive. And really what we're talking about is their fear of a radical, or what is actually termed discontinuous innovation, which is at the very, very, very top end, where generally a new product comes along and is so fantastic that it really hurts all of the incumbents, and it goes on to be a very disruptive force. It's that significant. And really, the traditional incumbents within the industry tend not to go down the radical or the discontinuous route themselves, to look at their own business model and say, well, how can we improve? How can we create something that will sort of future-proof us in years to come? And I think this is something, the radical and the discontinuous innovations, that we avoid. Whereas actually what we look at is we look at if we are in fact even looking at innovation, and let's say some of the incumbent companies actually have innovators within them, they are looking at what's known as an incremental innovation, which is sort of everyday small improvements to just keep on sort of improving the general product. And what this article goes on to talk about is that incremental innovation is really very simple, because it's looking at the lowest common factor, which is the customer, and that they are very comfortable with their customer. And what they are able to do is they're able to incrementally improve the product that they are selling continually. And it really does just keep the business sort of ticking over, and it doesn't really do anything different. And it goes on to say here that 1/3 of companies listed in 1970 Fortune 500 had vanished by 1983, and this was all attributed to not anticipating or embracing disruptive innovations, and really just continuing with that incremental improvements each time. And I found that a really important aspect that we start to look at. Now, the reason I bring this in as a topic is because I would expect that some people here will know the difference between sort of the incremental innovations and the radical innovations. But what I found particularly important here was that a lot of the reasons why people were not able to go down that much more radical based innovation and potentially disruptions was they weren't able to get the stakeholders and the funding behind them. And this article summarizes a literature review that looks at two aspects, which is a theory known as resource dependence and a theory known as path dependence. And what these both do is they prevent the stakeholders and the decision makers in investing in potentially radical innovations, because, and as they say, that it falls on deaf ears because they will not be able to fund a disruptive innovation. So resource dependency posits that a company's freedom of action is limited. Practitioners must ensure that they satisfy the needs of those entities outside the firm that give it the resources it needs to survive, primarily its customers and investors. When existing customers do not want any form of disruptive proposition because of appearances of potentially lower level performance, or practitioners ignore the new concepts and become focused upon satisfying their customers as a key resource stream. When investors want to see immediate and significant returns on investment, small markets do not appear to be attractive solutions to the growth needs of the companies. And in particular, this last point here, when investors want to see immediate and significant returns on investment, this really speaks to the fact that radical innovations could well be disruptive. They could well be failures. And so people are not looking at deploying resources to smaller areas which may not make a significant return. They're not interested in supplying resources where customers may not even be interested in this new proposition that is being proposed. And that is where the powers that be look at it and say, well, we don't want to supply the resource to make this work. The second element is that of what's called path dependency, which is when the organization remains focused on historically dependent technology, product or customer related paths which support and enhance continuous innovation. So the point being that this is really all about, well, we know this works and we know it makes money, so why should we risk it and go down something else which may not create any money at all? It may be negative even. It may disrupt the way that we make money. And this was exactly the reason they talked about Polaroid suffering Chapter 11 bankruptcy back in 2001, because the decision makers did not want to risk all of its history and go off onto different sort of paths of potential forms of innovation. So that for me was really interesting in my world. And what I really liked about it, Anthony, just to sort of bring it back around as to why I thought it was quite interesting, was the fact that two of the biggest challenges I see at the moment within traditional incumbents looking at innovation in a certain way, I actually originally thought about it when they think, I think it's a really good idea. We're going to bring on somebody to innovate, and they will bring on a senior executive that reports to the CEO, and that is their rubber stamp that they want to innovate. However, they have one massive problem, which is around misaligned incentives, which is where that individual is a risk to the rest of the entire organization, because the things that it does could potentially upset the traditional business model that it currently has.
Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome.
Exactly. Exactly. So you've got the misaligned incentives on an individual level, which is why I think innovation is very hard within traditional business sectors. But you've also got now this new resource dependency and a path dependency around the funding. And you often hear a resistance by sort of traditional companies saying, well, I just couldn't get stakeholder approval. And there's a lot of talk all the time around innovation, and we must have stakeholder approval to allow the project to go forward. How are you going to get stakeholder approval if there is resource dependency and path dependency on this is the way things are always done? And then secondly, how are you going to get an innovation scheme running when the person or persons who are in charge of innovating have completely misaligned incentives with all of their colleagues and everybody else within the organization, which means no one is going to want to support them if it means it's going to impact my personal bonus. I found it a really, really fascinating alternative perspective to the struggles of getting innovation in. That was rather a bit of a monologue for me.
It applies beautifully to real estate as well.
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
The incentive not to do anything much in real estate has been incredibly strong, and I always say, don't blame them. That's the sensible business move to do in most cases. There was somebody was writing on LinkedIn today, actually, was rather a doleful message saying they were worried about a lot of prop tech companies, because prop tech companies are going in trying to do something sort of new and novel, whereas for a lot of real estate companies at the moment, it works. Yeah. And we ain't got any money because it's all going on interest payments now. So yes, what you're doing is great. And he was saying, how many of these are set up to survive the sort of winter you'll find in a lot of real estate. But where I think it's super interesting in real estate is you're now getting, and why what's happening now in the office market is so genuinely disruptive, is because you're having an industry that for 40, 50 years has been all about incremental sustaining innovation, but they now have a problem where the market is going the wrong way from them, but they really have no choice to actually blow themselves up now because their customers disappeared. Customer has left the building. I don't want your product anymore. And when you suddenly get to a market where the only thing that takes a massive incumbent out of that incentives was when their customer disappears.
Yeah.
And so you've got it's this well, there's a thing I use in a lot of my talks where I talk about in evolutionary biology. There's a thing called a punctuated equilibrium, where a species, instead of developing in a linear fashion, suddenly splits and you get two species. And it's literally the turkey and Christmas. A turkey has a great life for 300 odd days, and then it all goes drastically wrong. Every day gets better until suddenly it gets completely wrong. But it's a big thing, and these sort of theories and understanding of all this it's very, very solid work, which it surprises me actually that everyone needs to know all of this stuff. You should just have this hard baked into your brain, whoever you are. Which
but it's not
when they buy your book.
We'll see. Anyway, what's that second article you've got? Let's do a quick summary of those two, because my last article is actually relatively straightforward and quite quick, and it is relatively linked to what I've just talked about with a sort of a new extension of.
I'm going to do a quick one.
Okay. Let me share it. Hang on.
I need to share.
Right, there you go. I've just shared it out.
You've got it. Okay. This was a write-up of a big survey experiment that was done as a joint venture between the Boston Consulting Group, Harvard, Wharton, and MIT.
Yeah.
And what they essentially did is they got 758, I think, BCG consultants, split them into three groups. One worked with ChatGPT 4.
Yeah.
One worked with ChatGPT 4 and had half an hour of training in using it, and then a third worked for without any generative AI at all. And they gave them two different projects to get involved with. But the headline, just to explain that, the headline performance figures were incredible. One of the tasks they got them to do was a creative product innovation task, and in that 90% of participants improved their performance, and what's more, they converged on a level of performance that was 40% higher than that of those working on the same task without GPT.
That's phenomenal.
Within creative tasks, it was incredibly powerful, and it raised everybody up. But they did another task which was about for a business process task, and it involved a lot more reasoning. And what they found in that is it actually had the opposite effect. It actually reduced people's capabilities by, on average, 23%, because it turns out people don't trust language models in terms of creativity, but they overtrust them in terms of reasoning. So the same tool can really improve your performance or can really diminish your performance. And they make the point that even with a small amount of training, that still didn't stop people having their performance reduced, because the small amount of training, in the sense of, that thing about little knowledge is a bad thing. People thought they were too good. They knew how to use these systems, and they accepted what it came back with very too much. So
that's quite an interesting observation, actually.
It's a really important one. So just out of the box, these tools are fantastic for creative tasks. They're still good for reasoning tasks and decision and business problem solving, but only if you have to put a lot more human intervention into working with them to get them to help you in that case. What they also found, because I just want to cover the main things. Even though on the creative tasks, they improved everybody's performance quite dramatically, what they also found, though, was that our study shows that the technology's relatively uniform output can reduce a group's diversity of thought by 41%. So at an individual level, everyone was becoming more creative, but they were actually, as a group, becoming more creative all in the same way. So you have to be careful of getting into a situation of over-trusting these systems, because you clearly need to pull in your own human creativity. And what they also found, so using the tools, it reduced the group's diversity of thought, but there was a great diversity of ideas between the machine and the humans. The ideas that the humans came up with actually had very little crossover with the ideas that the language model came up with. So actually the way to use these things is we need to use them, and we need to not use them, and we need to be building a bigger pie. So we take all the great ideas from the machines and all the great ideas for humans, and they are not going to be the same. But put them together, you should be creating a much bigger pie. And the last thing I just wanted to say about this is what they also found was that they got everyone to do a baseline performance task before they started, and then they judged between who had done better against their baseline performance. The people who were in the bottom half of the baseline performance saw their overall productivity rise by about 40%. So the lower, if you like, the lower skilled or the lower expert people were made much, much better. The people above the 50% baseline productivity measure were made about 17% better. So the point is, these tools are actually going to compress the diversity, or if you like, going to compress the inequality between skilled people and less skilled people. You're going to find your average person is actually going to find their life very much enhanced.
Yeah.
The super expert is probably going to lose a little bit of their edge, because Joe Average is going to be closer to them, which is a really interesting thing. And there's a MIT labor economist called David Autor, Autor, who has said that theoretically he sees generative AI as a way to rebuild the US middle class, because he says it is genuinely interesting that these tools look at the moment like they are going to improve the lot of, if you like, the middle classes as opposed to the experts, and they could be a really powerful tool for reducing inequality rather than expanding it.
Yeah, but that goes into complete contradiction to what you talked about earlier, though, right?
Well, not necessarily, but because a lot of this is a function of how things are actually used. And that's what's so interesting about this report, that you start to think this is if you were running a company these are tools that should be able to raise the average performance of everyone in my company considerably. So I should be able to raise the bar, the skill set, the capabilities of our company by training people in using these
Yeah,
tools.
okay. So, but going back to that original article that you shared, where it talked about the middle classes being most at risk from the disruptive elements of Gen AI. So let's
maybe
caveat
it's more
that.
the upper middle, maybe more the upper middle classes. So
I don't think it makes a massive difference. I think what does make a difference is the assertion that actually everybody is at a risk if they sleepwalk into this. And what they've got to understand is actually, if you, as I think you and I talked about right at the start, which is you have to augment yourself with understanding how these sorts of tools work, which mean you are an augmented human, to make it a bit grandiose, I suppose, whereas people who sleepwalk into it are going to suffer. That is the...
Well, absolutely. That's why I implore individuals in particular to really lean into these technologies now, because your company might take a while to be able to adopt this.
Yeah.
But these are tools that, as an individual, you can use very, 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 very quickly. So the capability, you have to be looking at exactly as you said. Your position in society is in danger with this technology in a way that it wasn't with other technologies 10 years ago. But your capabilities to actually improve your lot, if you lean in, are probably stronger than ever. So it gets back to the fundamental principle of don't coast. It's very dangerous to just coast along, push, and all the time. And actually, Murphy again has said the same thing as Picasso. It's really important to ask the good questions.
Absolutely. No, Murphy, you're very right. Well, look, I mean, I suppose it's got a nice segue into the final thing I was just going to talk about, which I'm not even going to share for now, just because I think it's just the concept is interesting. Because I think actually what this AI world is building out for us is a new opportunity, and that for me is quite exciting. And the final article I was going to talk about was actually another very much academic literature review of innovation and disruption. And in particular, this was referencing leadership. And it was talking about the fact that as leaders, we have to understand the difference between innovation and disruption, but at the same time realize there is a third classification, which not a lot of people often talk about. And it's actually called non-disruptive creation. And this is, I actually think, where, funnily enough, Anthony is a huge advocate for AI. I think this is where AI could come in, which is actually create these almost non-disruptive but new business models, which can, and a good example of this is how Ryanair and EasyJet, Southwest Airlines in the States, who's the Asian one? Anyway, all the low-cost airlines are a classic example of a non-disruptive creative element of an industry where they're not doing anything new. They're not coming up with anything brand new in terms of technology or brand new in terms of theory. They are just, in their case, they're undercutting on a pricing principle, but they are non-disruptive because they're making pools and pools and pools of money, but they're not disrupting anything. They're just bringing in perhaps new business models. And what they talked about was twofold, really, which was they can occur with either new or existing technologies, which may stem from a scientific invention or a technology-driven innovation, but it can also be generated without such an innovation, as with the case with microfinance. So there's a lot to talk about microfinancing being a classic case of this non-disruptive creativity as well. And it's also, in particular, it's applicable across geographical boundaries from developed markets to the bottom of the pyramid markets and at all levels of socioeconomic standing. So this, for me, I think is another area where I am particularly interested. I'm not going to bore you too many with the details. We've been on here for quite a long time, but don't just think that we have innovation and disruption and we have this potentially new wave of creative, non-disruptive creation, which come in, which then speaks back to everything that Anthony's already talked about when it comes to using AI for creative purposes and rethinking everything that you think is normal. I think that's an important point to finish on. Anthony, anything else you've got on your mind at the moment? Any other particular fascinations you've had this last couple of weeks?
To be honest, outside the world of generative AI, there is one thing actually. I actually received a new book yesterday, because before February I have to go to Paris, because in the Foundation Louis Vuitton is a huge Mark Rothko exhibition with over 150 Rothko paintings. So off at a tangent, but if you ever want to understand why Rothko's great, go to Paris, go to the Foundation Louis Vuitton, and have a wonderful day there.
How lucky you will be. All right, well, look, I am going to switch off the stream. Thanks, Anthony, for that, and we'll see you probably next week. But Murphy and Luke, thanks for your comments, guys. Good to see you all, and we'll be back next week.
Thank you.